A mAb, an anti-CGRP mAb, stops the pain. Fine, don't argue with it. If it's not broken, don't fix it. You're lucky. But at some point in time, it's probably going to stop working, or you probably won't be able to afford it. And when that happens, vitamin D3.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's Inspired Conversations, and I've got a repeat offender on my show, a repeat guest, and I have to say I'm always excited to catch up with Pete Batcheller. He is one intelligent dude, and a guy I've got a lot of respect for. Now, today we're talking monoclonal antibodies. Now, there are a couple of groups of people that are going to be interested in this topic. Particularly, we're making this for cluster headache and migraine sufferers that may be considering taking or are taking monoclonal antibody meds for their condition. But of course, monoclonal antibody meds have received a lot of press over the past 24 months. And going into it, I really didn't understand too much more about them, but I sure wanted to. So Pete, he's up on the screen now. Just give us that quick introduction into your background, Pete. Why should folks take what you've got to say with a grain of salt? What kind of qualifications have you got to be able to speak to the subject matter?
Well, going back to my degree was in chemistry, lots of biochemistry. And probably more importantly is I've spent the last 12 years doing research on nothing but cluster headaches, interventions, and primarily the use of vitamin D3 in preventing and controlling cluster headaches. I read an average of 2 to 3 studies a week, and it's just not just reading them. We dissect them and try and determine, is this a valid study, or is this a classic case of opposition research where big pharma has paid somebody to intentionally rig the study to result in the null hypothesis saying that no, you can't prove it. Vitamin D didn't work. And usually they do that with the dose being way too low, the association period too short. In other words, the amount of time spent on vitamin D3 was a matter of a few days instead of weeks or months. A minimum of 30 days in my book. Otherwise, you're not really testing it at all. And the dose has got to be over 10,000 IUD. So opposition research is something that I look for in just about any study involving vitamin D3, whether it's for cluster headache, COVID-19, whatever. It's got to be a big enough dose to make a difference, and at least what you would call a physiological dose, what your skin could make for you in 15 or 20 minutes of direct sunshine, which is upwards of 15,000 IU in a matter of minutes at the lower latitudes. So if the dose is high enough and the exposure period long enough, then they've got my attention. If it's too short, then I know the guy's either doesn't understand vitamin D3 or it's a rigged study, a classic case of opposition research, usually funded by big pharma or one of their acolytes.
I know a lot of people coming from the cluster family and background will be familiar with you, Pete. You're the designer of the vitamin D regimen, and we spent several wonderful hours together explaining the vitamin D anti-inflammatory regimen for cluster headache and migraine. The link's below, guys. It is a presentation worth checking out. We cover everything I could possibly think to ask Pete about vitamin D and the regimen in that video. So go back and check it out. But the purpose of today to talk about monoclonal antibody meds. Now, before we even do that, Pete, what is an antibody? I think that's probably the best place to start. And I tell you, the word antibodies popped up so many times recently as we go and have our vaccines for the novel coronavirus, and we talk about having an antibody response. So treat me like I know nothing about it. Tell me, what is an antibody?
Well, an antibody is a very important part of our immune system. It is normally expressed, which is a genetic expression term or molecular biological term, where the genes of a particular cell express a protein. And in this case, the protein happens to be an antibody. And it's a collection of components, if you will, and they come together as a protein and they're made by a cell. In this case, proteins are made by B cells, which originate in the spleen, and actually in the marrow, they mature in the spleen, particularly by B cells of our adaptive immune system. So if you want to play the quick game of how does this all happen, is it an antigen comes into the body. Let's just say, for the purposes of today's discussion, the antigen happens to be calcitonin gene-related peptide. It comes into the body and it hits the B cell, and the B cell says, "What's this? It's not me." The B cell has this IFF function, identification friend or foe, or self and non-self. So this ain't self. This ain't a friend. And it starts a biochemical process where it says, I need to identify this antigen that's coming in, and I will develop an antibody. And it genetically puts together an antibody. And that antibody attaches, it's got a very, we'll bring up the graphic, it's got an active set of claspers on the top of the Y shape, and they physically attach or they bind to the antigen and they mark it. It'd be like rolling a tar baby or a tar ball through a bowl of Rice Krispies. The Rice Krispies would stick to it. The Rice Krispies are the antibodies, and they would be all over it. Some antibodies are there just to mark, to let other cells in the body, like a killer T cell, which comes along and eats the whole virus or the whole antigen. Others have the ability to worm their way through the cell wall, or if it's a virus, through the shell of the virus itself, and actually go in and start destroying the contents. Others go to receptors at the cellular level, which bind to the top of a cell, and they let the cell know that there's something bad out there if it comes by. They generally, they're also referred to as globulins, immunoglobulins, and there's about 5 different kinds of them. And they have a molecular mass of around 150,000 Daltons. That's a unit of molecular mass measurement. That's your average everyday antibody that you've got floating around in your body. If you got exposed to chickenpox when you were a kid, you'd probably still have antibodies for chickenpox, because that B cell, when it starts expressing those antibodies, physically modifies its own DNA. It fundamentally writes down the recipe to make that particular antibody. And when that cell divides, the daughter cells carry with them that same recipe. And these cells continue to divide. After a while, you've got memory functions now, because the daughter B cells are carrying the same recipe for that particular antigen-derived animal, and they're going, oh, I know how to make antibodies now. And now you've got basic good immune capability against that particular antigen.
And so just bring it back in terms of what is an antigen, Pete? Now,
could be anything. Could be a chemical. It could be a virus. It could be a bacteria. It could be a fungal. Anything that's not us, not normal, not friend, and not self. And it causes problems when it gets into our system. And it's generally referred to as an antibody antigen reaction. So you put the antigen in there, and it causes the B cells to create an antibody.
And so there's not just one kind of antibody B cells are making. I think I know I've heard of I think they call them like IgG antibodies and
Yep.
IgM antibodies. So I know that they can now test these antibodies to see how strong someone's response was to taking a vaccine, for example. So is it important to kind of just talk about the different kinds of antibodies, or is that just a little bit too in
Oh,
depth?
sure. You get IgA, IgE, IgM, IgG. There's 5 basic types, and they cover, some of them cover bacteria, some of them cover virus, some of them cover other things like growth factors, tumor necrosis factors, different things that happen within the body. They're all normal functions for antigens coming into the body, and the B cells generate, in response to that, the antibodies. So it's a very normal and a very important part of our immune system. Now, within each type, IgG, for example, could be alerting on 37 or 40 different types of virus, and each one would be unique. Each virus that gets to that B cell would cause the B cell to genetically express a protein, and that protein is another antibody, and it will remember the recipe for it. That's our one big saving grace that happens with our adaptive immune system. It adapts to changing environments and remembers how to do it. It's interesting. The body does a lot of housekeeping. You might have a lot of antibodies shortly after an infection, but after a while, the body says, you haven't used it, I'm going to get rid of it. Now they'll filter it out and you pee or poo it over the side. It's gone. But the B cells that make them, I remember how to make that. So if I see that virus or that particular antigen coming into my environment again, I will make the antibody for it. So you can actually deplete the serum concentration of antibodies. You can measure them until they go down to 0. But the B cell knows how to make them. And the T cells of the adaptive immune system, they remember it as well. And when they divide, they remember what it looked like and what the bad guys are. So they basically have corporate memory.
Just tell me, Pete, a question that kind of pops up into my mind before we move on to talk about these meds. Is that kind of immunological memory passed down to offspring? So if my mother came across an antigen when she was living in Papua New Guinea?
No, a certain amount of it starts happening in the womb. It starts happening during birth and shortly after birth. One of the biggest things is a new child or a new animal needs to start suckling mother's milk to get the colostrum. What's in that? Well, there's all kinds of antibodies or antigens, if you will, that starts building the immune system within the newborn baby, be it an animal or a human.
And that's
so it's something you're developing throughout your entire life.
I guess that's why they were, during the past 2 years, they were talking about protect our young ones by getting vaccinated against COVID-19, because their immune systems are still developing in terms of being exposed and forming that immunological memory.
You just hit the magic. What makes the immune system work? I mean, we can go back in recorded history from caveman chisel marks or paintings on the walls of caves, and there have been evidence of epidemics, pandemics, and terrible plagues since the earliest recorded history. But there have always been survivors. And you go, well, how come there were survivors? Well, they were more fit. This gets a bit Darwinian. Okay, what made them more fit? They had a better immune system. Their immune system was capable of adapting to the changing environment. It could adapt and start expressing antibodies for the antigens that were attacking. Okay, well, what made the immune system so much better? And the answer is vitamin D3. Without vitamin D3, all these marvelous immune system functions go right down the dumper. Without vitamin D3, the innate immune system, which is like the Marine Corps, they go charging into the battlefield. They don't know when to stop. And all of a sudden you start creating inflammation. And instead of having the adaptive immune system come in and say, okay, that's enough. That's enough. That's enough. Let me use some smart weapons now instead of brute force. Only without vitamin D3, that doesn't happen. And we end up with a dysregulated immune system. For example, the coronavirus is active in the human body and replicating for about 12 days. After that, it stopped. The viral activity has almost ceased. What people are suffering from then is a runaway dysregulated immune system, which is creating all kinds of inflammation. And unless they stop it, it just keeps cannonballing and cascading into pneumonia and all kinds of other things until finally you overload the system and you start getting organ shutdown. Now you got real problems.
It makes me want to ask, well, what's the point of the immune system having that strong reaction in the first place? What's the purpose of inflammation?
Well, good point. All things in moderation. A little inflammation starts drawing attention to an area that's being invaded, be it the sinus passages, the mucosal membranes throughout the lungs. Any place where foreign bodies get into the body, get into your body, our body, ears, nasal passages, mouth, urogenital passages. Anytime you got something entering the body through any of those passageways, it's going to create a problem unless the immune system, I recognize it, that's a bad guy or that's a good guy, and we'll take care of the bad guy. So a little bit of inflammation says, hey, let's heat things up a little bit, raise the body temperature in that area, dilate the vascular system so that the white blood cells can get to that area and start eating the bad guys. So a little bit of it is part of the natural immune response and the healing process that's going to take care of the damage caused by invading pathogens. What we don't want to happen, and what unfortunately has been happening, and people didn't recognize it early on, is a dysregulated immune system, where that first thrust the Marines into the battle space, they just got carried away and they created so much inflammation that as part of the innate immune system, that the adaptive immune system, which was lacking vitamin D3, couldn't come along with the smart weapons and say, calm down, here's some smart weapons to use, antibodies, which will make marking the bad guys a lot easier. So you go out and shoot them in the dark, they'll glow. So that was the big thing that we learned, unfortunately, time and time again with COVID-19. It's the immune system the dysregulated immune system that people are suffering from, and that's what needs to be treated. All the antivirals don't mean squat diddly after 12 days. The virus is already dead. They're not going to do a thing for you. Remdesivir does nothing for you.
So let's press on then. So we kind of get an understanding of what an antibody is and why they're made by our body in response to an antigen. So we move on to say, well, monoclonal antibody meds. I've really only started to hear about them in the past 3 or 4 years, Pete, in the cluster and migraine circles, and then most recently with COVID-19. What are they? How are they made? The composition, names, molecular sizes. Tell me about them.
Well, they are a class of intervention that are called biologics. They're not a drug. They're biologic because they're made from a biological process. And fundamentally, this dates back to about 1986 when the first monoclonal antibody was approved by the FDA. And the acronym is small m, capital A, small b, s, mAbs. That's the acronym that you use for monoclonal antibodies. And they're developed primarily from murine. And you go, okay, what's murine? That's mouse. They're developed from mouse B cells. So they basically inoculate a mouse with a antigen, in this case, CGRP, and they get a B cell reaction, and the B cell starts making antibodies. So they zap the poor mouse, go in and harvest these things, harvest these B cells from the spleen, and they start culturing them in little dishes. And they want one or two cells in each dish. So they want to try and get a pure line of B cells. And they test it. And they keep testing it. And then they grow a bunch of them. And then they put some CGRP in there and see how fast they make the antibodies. And as soon as they start seeing the same antibodies coming from the same type cells, then they clone that particular genetic line of B cells. They put them in a growth medium and they let them divide. But that gives us the first cut at a monoclonal antibody. And they're given a special name. The next phase is to go in and genetically edit the genetic sequences to take out the mouse sequence and put in a human sequence. And this is called humanizing. And after the first pass of humanizing, they end up with a chimeric. And if you remember from your days of studying Greek mythology, chimera is half lion, half lizard, or half dragon, and it's half and half. Well, they keep replacing those murine segments with human genetic sequences until they get a humanized B cell. Now that B cell is going to start, when it's triggered by the antigen, in this case CGRP, it's going to start making those Y-shaped antibodies. Well, now that antibody is like 90% human, but it's still got the two little active parts that physically attach, but those are still murine. Now, in some cases, they actually start with human B cells and they stimulate them with an antigen until they find the right combination that results in the antibody that they're looking for. And one of the common ones is trying to find tumor necrosis factor alpha. That's a good one that you want to be able to downregulate, because that's a runaway, if you will, during all kinds of joint inflammation. People have all kinds of joint problems, and that's the simple way of going after them, is going after whatever it is that is triggering the inflammation in the joint. Humira, one of the big ones.
Why, Pete, do they need to start with a murine B cell? Why wouldn't you always start?
Ethics is, it's not nice to screw around with people. It's a lot easier screwing around with a mouse.
What, in terms of retrieving the B cells?
Yeah, you got to zap them and take their spleens out and isolate the B cells.
Okay. And then go through a process of humanizing that cell line.
Yes.
Okay.
It gets a little complicated. It's kind of like sausage. It tastes good, but you really don't know how to make it. If you ever watch the process of making sausage, you go, I don't think I want that anymore.
So you spoke a little bit at the start of the talk in and around the size of an antibody. So are these humanized monoclonal antibodies that they've genetically modified and started to culture and multiply? Are they the same size as one that I'm making?
They're almost all the same size. Whether it's an antibody that your body cooked up because you had the flu, and of course you get a different one for every strain of flu, but for the chicken pox, it remembers that. It's the same size antibody. I mean, they may vary by a little bit, but they're all generally between 140,000 and 150,000 Daltons. 150K, 144K. Emgality is about 144, 500K.
So you sent me a little graphic. Talk to me about this graphic. A murine, chimeric, humanized, and human. a little bit more, please?
Well, the mouse graphic just tries to give a representation of the percentage of mouse genes that were physically in the B cell that results in the antibody, the Y-shaped antibody. And as you work your way towards fully humanized, then you've done as much removal of the murine segments, genetic sequences, and you've replaced them with human genetic sequences. Now, if you started with a human B cell, then you're fully humanized.
Yeah, okay. You talk about identification of friend or foe, and how our bodies are pretty good at going, that's not me. Talk to me then, why isn't our body kind of smart enough to recognize that these monoclonal antibodies, when they're injected, are not from a human cell line?
The answer is it does recognize them as antigens. Your own immune system takes a look and says, that ain't one of mine. I didn't make that. That's not one of my antibodies. That's an antibody that came in. That's a foreign invader as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not gonna own it. I'm not gonna replicate it. That's why you have to keep getting shots of these things every month, because the body filters them out. It doesn't like those things.
Okay.
And not only that, but the body will start developing an antigen antibody reaction against the monoclonal antibodies. They don't talk about that very much, but it happens.
So let's start talking about these drugs then, and maybe they're not a drug, as you say, they're a biologic.
Biologic. By definition, a biologic.
One of the brand names people are going to be familiar with is Emgality. Now, so talk to me about Emgality and how does it work? What is it doing?
Well, the CGRP or anti-CGRP antibodies either go after the actual calcitonin gene-related peptide itself, or they go after the receptor, and they try and block the receptor where that CGRP molecule lands and starts triggering the inflammation, the neurogenic inflammation, and the nociception or pain we associate with cluster headache. It stops the cell from expressing CGRP. It doesn't. What it does is it blocks the cell from doing it if it goes after the receptor. And after that, it goes after the CGRP that the cell has released. But all of that takes place within the brain, within the trigeminal ganglia, and physically within the neurons and glia, which is the structural nerve cell that holds everything together. So the injection of monoclonal antibodies into the arm goes into the bloodstream. But you got to get from the bloodstream into the brain, into the trigeminal ganglia complex, trigeminal vascular complex, and physically in there. And there's this thing called the blood-brain barrier, which are tightly packed endothelial cells that are more tightly packed as all of these vascular systems run through the central nervous system and the brain. They're really tight. And the windows that allow molecules through that tightly packed endothelial cell lining have an aperture big enough to allow a molecule of molecular mass no larger than 400 Daltons. So the window's only 400 Daltons big.
Okay.
So to get from the bloodstream into the brain, you got to be small enough to pass through a 400 Dalton window. And the mAbs all have 1440 to 150,000 Daltons.
Yeah, so if I go 150,000 divided by 400, is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, 375 times too big.
That's 375, exactly. So
yeah.
So
you're trying to shove a watermelon through a straw, it ain't gonna go.
or a basketball into a golf tee, a golf hole. It's
Yeah.
just
So the logic is pretty simple. I'm not a molecular biologist. I'm a fighter pilot, but I'm pretty good at logic. And if you can't get to the site of action, the mechanism of action to downregulate and slow down the production of CGRP, which is within the neurons, within the trigeminal ganglia, you got two of them, one on each side of your head, you're not going to be able to influence those neurons because the CGRP monoclonal antibodies, anti-CGRP monoclonal antibodies, are still stuck in the bloodstream. So then you ask the question, well, how come some people say, well, it worked? Well, turns out CGRP is expressed by cells throughout the body. Almost every tissue and cell type has the capacity to express genetically produced CGRP, and it gets into the bloodstream. Well, now the monoclonal antibodies, the anti-CGRP they can do a good job on that. They stop the ones in the bloodstream, but they can't do diddly for the ones that are made inside the trigeminal ganglia and the neurons and the glia. They can't get there from here. So they may be able to reduce the pressure or the loading factor of CGRP on the brain, but they're not going to stop it. They can't. If they can't get to the source.
So what you're kind of saying, and like in a simple man's kind of understanding, is the CGRP's in your brain. It's used throughout your body. If you inject these meds into your arm, they're able to bind to all the CGRP molecules that are in this part of my body.
In your bloodstream,
and thus reduce the amount of CGRP that's potentially circulating in my brain and maybe stop the headache.
It's probably a lot more complex than that, but that's the simple answer. Yes. If you reduce the load overall of CGRP produced elsewhere in the body, that might be just enough to lower the frequency of your migraines from the average migrainer has 3 to 5 a month that last anywhere from 4 to 40 hours each. And if they got one day less a month, they go, well, that's a 20% or a 25% reduction in frequency. That's huge. But it's not stopping all of them.
Yeah, okay. And so I also wanted to ask then, we know that not all of these monoclonals are binding to the CGRP to prevent it being uptaken at the receptor sites. Some of them are actually blocking the receptors. So again, my simple question from a simple understanding would be, well, if you're blocking the receptors down here, wouldn't that then increase the amount of CGRP that could get up there? Well,
no. The net effect is a lower serum concentration of CGRP. If it blocks the receptors so that those cells that carry that genetic makeup to express CGRP aren't triggered into making it, so they make less CGRP.
Okay.
Here's a simple thing. You ever have one of those itches in your back and you start to scratch and it hurts a little? It stings just a little bit when you start scratching it. That's probably just a nanomolecule or two of CGRP right there in a nerve ending next to a hair follicle, and it's an itch. If it was much bigger, it'd be very painful. But if it's just one or two, it's an itch, and you scratch it and you dilute it and you bring white blood cells in, and the itch goes away. You see bears scratching their back up against the trees. Hey, that's an example of what a little bit of CGRP can do in the skin.
Right. Now, CGRP is the target of these medications, but in a paper I was reading recently on cluster headache and migraine headache, it wasn't just talking about CGRP, Pete, it was talking about the other neuropeptides we discussed in our previous talk, VIP, PACAP, SP, for example. So are these monoclonals also lowering the serum of those other neuropeptides?
They're not doing diddly squat for the other neuropeptides. And more importantly, they're not doing anything for that cocktail of inflammatory mediators that are released from mast cells as part of an allergic reaction. And histamine leads the band on that one. Does nothing for histamine, does nothing for all of these little molecules that come out of a mast cell. And they're all inflammatory mediators. Leukotrienes, prostaglandins, TNF alpha. I mean, there's a cocktail of those things in there, but leading the bandwagon is pardon me, not CGRP, but leading the bandwagon is the bad stuff, which is when you finally have an allergic reaction, you're creating a flood of histamine. And histamine goes into it goes right through the blood-brain barrier, and it's released within there. The mast cells are right there in the trigeminal complex. They get into the neuron and they go, make CGRP, make SP, make all those 4 primary neuropeptides. And oh, by the way, while we're here in this cocktail of inflammatory mediators, we're going to make your trigeminal ganglia puff up and get all swollen and make it worse. Monoclonal antibodies don't do diddly for that. Not a bit.
Okay. So this is probably where one of the aspects of vitamin D it really it blows my mind. So we understand that 375 times too big to get into the brain, these meds. Tell me about vitamin D.
Okay, a native molecule of cholesterol, vitamin D3, has a molecular mass of 385 Daltons. So it's smaller by 15 Daltons to fit through that 400 Dalton window. And if it gets hydroxylated in the liver, it picks up another 15 Daltons, and it becomes 400 Daltons, which just is good enough to get through. So the vitamin D we're taking orally or producing in our skin, cutaneous vitamin D3, because we get the ultraviolet radiation striking cholesterol in our skin and converting it to cholesterol, vitamin D3, that goes through the bloodstream, goes into the brain and central nervous system, and right into the cells, neurons, and glia, where the vitamin D3 and the 25-OH-D3 come up against a couple enzymes. One of them that converts vitamin D3 to 20, that hydroxylates it from vitamin D3 to 25 hydroxy vitamin D3, and then there's the 1-alpha hydroxylase, which adds that hydroxyl group to the first position on the vitamin D3 molecule, and we end up with a genetically active 125-OH2D3 calcitriol, and that's what triggers it. It attaches first to a molecule of retinol, vitamin A. And so now we have a dimer. It's a molecule made by 2 other molecules. And on one end is vitamin D3, on the other end is the retinol or vitamin A. It attaches to an RXR, a retinoid X receptor, another little protein. And on the vitamin D side of this dimer, it attaches to a VDR, a vitamin D receptor, another important protein. And these are part of the metabolic pathway that vitamin D3 takes to initiate genetic expression. So then you got this dimer with the 2 connectors on it, and they physically attach to a strand of DNA at what's called a VDRE, which is a vitamin D receptor element. And that triggers, it's like taking a rope and untwisting it until you get one spiral coming off of it, which is a strand of RNA, and it clones that RNA. It makes a copy of that RNA, and that's called a messenger RNA, and then passes that strand out of the nucleus into the cytosol, into the juice within the cell, where it's picked up by these little drug factories And they in turn pull the necessary amino acids out of the cell juice, and they put it together, and out pops protein. So,
and so just to be very clear, out pops the protein, and the protein being a vitamin D response element.
No. In this case, you may have triggered one of the four actions that are common with what happens when you're talking about genetic expression. Replication, these little peptides or proteins signal the cells to start replicating, start reproducing, change their functions, where you have a native leukocyte, blood cell, and you feed it enough vitamin D3, it becomes King Kong, and it turns into a giant T-Rex, and it starts eating everything in sight, all the bad stuff. You can't do that without the vitamin D3. So replication, differentiation, you've differentiated that initial cell type into something different with a different function. We upregulate and downregulate the production of other cellular or genetic products, peptides, proteins, so that, you can have one gene. If it doesn't get any vitamin D3, it's a bad actor. It will make you sick. If it gets enough vitamin D3, it stops making the bad stuff and it starts making good stuff.
That's probably a good point. I think there's several thousand, at least 2,000 vitamin D response elements in human DNA. And I was reading a paper that says that in most of the cases, vitamin D will downregulate the expression of that response element rather than upregulating its expression. Is that kind of a line?
Well, when we talk about endocrine systems, we're talking about a ductless gland in one part of the body that releases an agent that passes through the bloodstream, and it creates a response in another part of the body. When we're talking vitamin D3, we get down to a little smaller scale, and we have intracrine and paracrine. Okay, people get confused. Well, what's the difference? Well, paracrine works around the outside of cells, and it's a protein, and it attaches to receptors on the surface of that cell. That tells the cell to start doing different things. That's paracrine. Intracrine, where this little critter that got expressed by a gene over here in another cell, or by the same cell, physically goes into the cytoplasm and into the nucleus, and it changes the function of a gene or several genes within that nucleus. Now that's an intracrine signaling. So paracrine signaling around the outside of the cell membrane, intracrine signaling at the genetic layer of DNA. It's physically getting into the DNA, and it's signaling that DNA to start doing different things, spawning off a messenger RNA segment, which is passed out of the nucleus, and it's picked up by the ribosomes, the little factories. How many ribosomes? Millions and millions of ribosomes in every cell. The cell that has the most? I mean, it's so loaded with ribosomes, it's unbelievable. Almost too many to count.
If I was going to guess, I'd say the placenta, maybe the eggs.
The human egg. Human egg. Because think about it. You got this, it's big enough to see with a human eye. And one little sperm, which you can't see, finally breaks through the cell wall and gets inside, and the two haploid genetic mixes come together, and you have a full set of all the genes and chromosomes you need. And they start dividing. And there are instructions in there to build a you or build a me with blue eyes and gray hair or whatever. All those instructions are in there. But each time that happens, we're talking about a piece of protein being picked up by one of those little ribosomes, and it's kicking off another protein that's going to signal that cell to start doing something different.
So there's
just a fundamentally just unbelievably amazing things are all made possible by these little subcellular drug factories called ribosomes.
Yeah. There are a couple of things that then spring to mind. One of them is that I think you call it a heterodimer, the RXR and the vitamin D molecule. What identifies the vitamin D response element in DNA?
Now you're getting above me, but fundamentally, there's a chemical attraction that occurs at a larger scale, and this is part of what happens when you start having an injury someplace in your body, and the body starts kicking off signals. The white blood cell uses what's called chemotaxis. In other words, it's like a bloodhound. It's following the blood in the water until it gets to the site of the injury, and then it starts eating the bad guys. Same thing kind of happens with genes, and when you're talking about vitamin D3 and the complex, that molecule of vitamin D3 and molecule of vitamin A, and they're two attached, RXR and VDR, and they attach to that segment. And it's, well, the genetic wizards will tell you exactly what it is. There's a name for it. And that starts the process of spawning off that segment of messenger RNA. It says you go so many segments this direction and make me one of those.
And
it gets way too technical for me to try and describe it. I don't understand that part of it either.
No, I understand, and it's also not only identifying that response element, but also how much of that response element it would like the ribosomes to then make. And in this case, we're talking about the constituents. And is it fair to call a neuro-peptide a protein, Pete?
Oh yes, technically they're a protein.
Right, and so when we say the trigeminal neurons, without being regulated by the active form of vitamin D, will produce all these constituents that drive the risk of me having a headache way higher than if it's kind of like. It's kind of like in my country, we used to have these traffic officers. If a traffic light broke down, you'd have this dude and he would stand there and he would give the signal for that traffic to come and then stop. You can come through, you stop. And it's like without that traffic cop at that intersection, it's absolute chaos. Everything's
and you're exactly right. And in molecular biology, they're called toll-like receptors. It's like the guy at the bridge who's collecting tolls. You got to pay the toll to get across the bridge. Those are toll-like receptors.
So before we move on, I want to be real specific because there have been people that have been following my podcast. It really has grown. People are interested in the vitamin D topic like no man's business. But we know now that once that vitamin D molecule is hydroxylated in the liver, and even before that, it binds with vitamin D binding protein. Now, vitamin D binding protein isn't as big as a mAb, but it's certainly bigger than 400 Daltons. So
yes, it is.
If you've got this molecule of vitamin D, which is just God had made that molecule so perfect that it can fit through this blood-brain barrier like it was made to go in there. But if it's being transported with this big molecule of vitamin D binding protein, what happens? How's that binding protein going along through that 400 Dalton gap?
Well, that's a good point. And then, assuming you get through the gap, which it can't, how does it get through the cell wall? And the answer is there's a certain amount of disassociation. In other words, when you write a chemical equation, you have let's say H2, two atoms of hydrogen, and for a few brief nanoseconds, it's H1 and H1, and then they're back together again. Well, when you're talking about vitamin D3 and the binding protein, and there's another protein that's in our body that's produced in the kidneys that also binds to vitamin D3. And between the two of them, the VDR is more potent, but the other one is actually more prevalent in the blood solution. But what happens is a small amount of it does get loose, and it goes through the cellular membrane and through the the windows, if you will, through the blood-brain barrier. It allows the individual molecule of vitamin D to go through. And we've talked about this is a unique thing about the nude or the naked hormone.
We start talking about the free hormone hypothesis,
Yes.
which is I guess beyond the scope of this discussion.
It's proven enough, and if you look at the dissociation constants, chemical term for how often it disassociates from the complex of the binding protein and vitamin D3, there's enough of it to happen to get through. We know it. We know that the complex itself is too big to get through. So just by simple logic, intuitive thinking here, some of it's getting through because it's creating enough of a genetic expression, a genetic response within the trigeminal ganglia, within the neurons and glia, to downregulate the production of CGRP, SP, VIP, and PACAP, and at the same time, downregulate the release of all those nasty inflammatory agents that are released from mast cells. And actually, if you take enough vitamin D3, the body starts making fewer mast cells. They're not needed as often, but they're an essential part of the body's defense mechanism. Mast cells are there for a good reason. When you have an injury, boom, they're going to go there and they're going to release those inflammatory agents and create inflammation at the site of the injury. Boom, that's an insult. Get the white blood cells in the army in there to fix it. So it's a normal part of a healing process. We just don't want it to get out of control, and specifically out of control within the trigeminal vascular complex. Because once it gets the trigeminal vascular system up on a step and all just nervous and nelly, boom, you're going to get a headache, one right after the other.
So we want to press on, Pete. So look, monoclonal antibodies, we've been talking about cluster and migraine headache, but I tell you, last year, the ever popular Joe Rogan, he got crook, as you probably will have heard through the media, and he took several medications. I know there was a hell of a raucous around ivermectin, the horse drug, but at any rate, he also took monoclonal antibodies. Now,
Right.
Just so talk to me about this. Why is he taking monoclonals? He doesn't get headaches.
No, in this particular case, the monoclonal antibody that they were after was one that stops viral replication. Well, let's play the game. You normally walking down the street, you ingest or inhale microspheres containing a million virus. Let's take the adenovirus or the rhinovirus, both common in colds. It gets in there, it hits your mucous membrane, and the battle starts. The immune system's trying to stop them, but the virus is replicating and it's taking over cells and hijacking the cell's DNA and inserting its own DNA in there and turning that cell into a factory to make more virus. That process continues for maybe 12 days max. And at some point in there, it plays out. It stops making, the viral replication ceases. When do you start the symptoms? Well, the symptoms don't start until about 6 to 7 days after you've been infected. So by the time you start having the runny nose, the sore throat, and all that, you've already had the virus cooking away in your body for 4 or 5 days. That's when that monoclonal antibody would have done some good. But if you're past that period, the virus have stopped replicating, the monoclonal antibody is not going to do any good at all. It's like ivermectin doesn't do any good once the viral replication portion of the infection is done. Nothing, there's no benefit to it at all. Now it's become a harm. It's causing more problems than it is good. That's every drug has the power to help. It also has the power to harm. So you're always looking for the risk-reward ratio. And after the virus has stopped replicating, there's no reward for the monoclonal antibodies that they were giving Joe Rogan.
So as we move on to talk about the specific monoclonals that have been designed and really in a blip of time recently released to the market, there's a few of them. Can you just tell me what they are? I know we've talked about Emgality, and they've got crazy names in terms of their generic medical term.
I need to pull up my cheat sheet, but I've got them listed for you. I gave them to you in that one list.
We'll put them up. We'll put them up on screen.
But there's about 5 or 6 of them that have been developed. Only about 3 or 4 that have been approved in the U.S. by the FDA. One's been approved. I think the 4th has been approved in the EU, but not yet in the U.S. Emgality is one of them. Trying to think of the other one. It was one of the first ones that came out.
Aimovig is a
Aimovig, yes.
And one that I didn't see listed, I think Ajovy is another one that I see discussed quite often.
Ajovy. Then there's another class of biologic called the Gepants, Gepants. And these are, quote, small molecules. They're still way too big to get through the blood-brain barrier that help downregulate CGRP. And the name of the drug ends in Japan, Gepant. So you'll see that in some of the, if you go to the CGRP forum, I've been a member there for many years. And if you go through some of their source documentation, you'll find that they will quietly admit that very, very small amount, only very, very small amounts of the CGRP, anti-CGRP monoclonal antibodies ever make it through the blood-brain barrier. And the Japans have that very same problem. And they've measured the penetration in rats, and it's like 0.03, which is not very much in terms of the ratio. 3 parts per thousand. Pardon me, 3 parts per 100.
Yeah,
less than 3%.
Can they not just inject these drugs directly into the brain?
No, not really. That's pretty dicey. The blood-brain barrier is there to protect us from big bad chunks of bad crap floating around in the bloodstream.
Right. And so, like, how old are these things? Like, are they? I've only seen them kind of being discussed in the cluster and migraine forums, maybe about 4 or 5 years. Like, are they that new?
Well, most of them started being approved in 2010. The first one started being approved in 2010. Entered the FDA approval process in 2010. And we knew it was submitted. They'd done their study. And I don't recall exactly what the date was when it was approved. I think it was 2012 or 2014, somewhere in there, that they got final FDA approval. But I can look it up. Don't hold me to the wall on that one. But I remember the big studies came out because all of the top neurologists, these are the big guys who sit the boards for the ICH3 headache, the International Headache Classification System, and you'll see Peter Dodick, and you'll see a couple of the other big neurologists who are very big. They chair these boards for different types of primary headaches, and they're deeply involved in these studies.
They're expensive, Pete, like really expensive. I've seen many posts from folks complaining that their insurance no longer covers the cost for one reason or another, and some of the bills are just astronomical. What makes this
$4,000 to $7,000 per subcutaneous injection? That's the street price. Now, the drug companies are going to say, "Oh, well, we'll give you a special deal. First two are free." I mean, you talk to the guy selling smack heroin on the street. Hey, have a taste. It's free. You know, here's some free heroin. Here's some more free heroin. And after a couple of weeks, they go, "I need more." Well, now you're going to have to pay me $20 a pop. So, I mean, we've seen that before with illicit drugs, and they're doing the same thing. And the insurance companies, we go, my God, let's go back and just revisit the folks at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services would not cover the cost of oxygen. My God, it's been around since Christ was a corporal. We know it works. Well, you never did a study on it. That's because it was common. We didn't do a study, triple blind study on parachutes either. You want to have somebody put the placebo parachute on their back and jump out of an airplane? That's not too smart. So we finally got them wrapped around the axle, tightened up to where they said, "Oh, okay, all right," but they still begrudgingly approve and cover the expense of oxygen. But that's only taken us 10 years.
Yeah, okay. And so we've talked about these monoclonals for cluster migraine being solely focused on CGRP and not doing anything for any of the other constituents that are associated with cluster headache. Then we've also talked about vitamin D being able to influence all of these constituents. So just it's almost like if I were to use the analogy of dealing with the horse before it bolts the gate versus dealing with the horse once it's already bolted. Would that be a fair analogy to make?
That's a very fair analogy. Where in the process are you going to intervene in the process of releasing those peptides that are causing the cluster headache? Once they're loose in the system, now you got to go after them one-on-one. If you can go back to the headwaters, to the cell that's making them, which is a neuron or a glia within the trigeminal ganglia, slap its wrist and say, "Don't do that. Don't make those. I'll give you something better to do. Have some vitamin D3. Downregulate the expression of these neuro-peptides. Upregulate some of these other functions." And the neuron says, "Okay, I'll do that." So now you've gone way upstream where unfortunately, most of the pharmaceutical interventions go after the symptoms. They don't go upstream and look at the actual cause. Now, there's a term for this, and I gotta go fishing in my deep brain here. It's a neurogenic issue where we're suffering from a lack of a nutrient that was genetically determined to be important. There's several diseases that fall in this category. Scurvy. This is a terrible disease. Limeys lick lime to get the vitamin C to stop scurvy. That's why they were called limeys. They were always licking limes. It stopped the scurvy. Rickets, curly legs, soft bendy bones, vitamin D3. Beriberi and pellagra, two different types of vitamin B complex, stops them completely. And if you want to play that game and you start looking at all of the autoimmune disorders, and I mean, there's over 180 of them that are caused, in my way of thinking, by a lack of vitamin D3. You got all the gut problems, the leaky gut, Crohn's, rheumatoid arthritis, joints, vitamin D3. If you look at the profile, the risk profile for these different diseases or medical conditions, you see there's a lack of vitamin D3 associated with all of it. And when you start treating with large doses, physiological doses, 15,000 IU is a maintenance dose and a couple hundred to 600,000 to a million IU as a loading dose to get your serum level 25 up where it needs to be, then things start happening.
Yeah, and I guess the big argument I get from folks maybe from the root cause protocol, as an example, are going to say it's masking your symptoms, it's not making you better. And I've always been cognizant to kind of be critical to the success I've seen with vitamin D, Pete, to say I don't want to fall down a rabbit hole here and be selling snake oil. But time and time again, the feedback that I get from, well, we've got several thousand people more now that have seen success using vitamin D in the treatment of cluster headache. But as you know, I run a vitamin D test business down here in New Zealand, and people are finding me and sharing their personal stories with me as well. Last week,
that's great.
And it's not just stopping with cluster headache. I had a gentleman with multiple sclerosis reach out last week, Pete, and say, I'm interested to come on your show and just tell my personal story. He's not too far into his treatment or therapy with vitamin D following the Coimbra protocol, but he's seen some dramatic improvements in his quality of life so far. He's able to control his bladder now, which is I can only imagine for a person going down that journey with multiple sclerosis, how hard that must be for a guy that's in the prime of his life to be dealing with this, and then to be motivated to reach out to share his story because of the improvement that he's seen is it just confirms for me that there is something in it, and all the information that I've learned from you over the years is being reinforced and supported in so many areas of my life, from personal stories, from new research being published, from the good work that Henry Lahore's doing over at the Vitamin D Wiki.
Yep.
All these pieces are coming together to kind of support this overall picture of what we're talking about now. As we move to maybe conclude and move towards a summary point here, CGRP, it's implicated in migraine and cluster headache. Both vitamin D and these monoclonal antibody meds are working with this molecule. The monoclonals solely focused on this molecule, vitamin D working with the range of constituents and molecules associated with cluster headache.
Working with the cells that express them. That's the key thing. We get to the headwater and say, stop making those bad guys. You're really making progress. And this is where we run into problems, because the biggest speed bump that most cluster of migraine, they start vitamin D3, is an allergic reaction. Well, what happened? That causes mast cells to degranulate. You got a good graphic of that, and you can put that and show what it looks like. And all that cocktail of inflammatory mediators to release it's just a bag of granules. It looks like a clear plastic bag of marbles, and it ruptures and it releases all these marbles into the bloodstream and the tissues, and they're just loaded with all of these inflammatory mediators. That overloads vitamin D3. It's too much, can't get here from there. It says, I'm more powerful than you are. So then we have to come in with another intervention and try and tamp down the big problem, which in most cases is the histamine, and we start blocking the histamine receptors. This is where I finally came up with a collection of supplements with anti-histamine properties. That's the Monty, and it's working. That's the amazing thing. And I'm getting feedback from more and more people who were either completely pain-free on it, and all of a sudden they got hit from behind by a Mack truck and they can't stop them, and no amount of vitamin D is working. I said, you need the antihistamine full Monty. Or the other kid that is just getting started, I said, I just can't get a pain-free response. I said, you're probably fighting an allergic reaction. Your immune system is battling this, and it's causing those cells to release all of these inflammatory mediators. We got to block the receptors for those things. And once you start blocking those receptors, then vitamin D3 has a chance to do its thing Down-regulate the bad guys, up-regulate the good guys.
The risk profile, Pete. So what are the risks associated with these new monoclonals?
Well, we already discussed one of them a little bit, and that is a reaction by the body's immune system to them. They're a foreign agent. They're an antigen. So our immune system is going to look at these monoclonal antibodies and say, you're not one of me. You're not me. You're not a friend. And if you look, you can go into any of the WebMD, any of the sites and look up the problems associated with monoclonal antibodies, the anti-CGRP, mAbs. And you look at all of them, it starts with inflammation at the injection site. Well, that's an allergic reaction. Difficulty breathing. Well, that's an allergic reaction. Anaphylaxis. That's a major, now your body's trying to shut down with a major allergic reaction. So almost all of them are associated with the immune system. The immunological response to these things is not that great. My experience with monoclonal antibodies started out in 2000 when I was suffering from a genetically determined problem where my retina were trying to reject me. And I went to my Navy doctor and he says, okay, I can put you on prednisone. But they're doing a study across the street at NIH. And I went over there and they put me on more prednisone. And I ballooned up from 175 to 250 pounds almost overnight. I had to buy I'm in business. I had to buy brand new heart mark suits and everything. And then they started me on the second leg of this thing, which was a monoclonal antibody called diclizumab. And I read this big, long sheet of paper, informed consent. This will attack your immune system. You could have different types of cancers. You can have different types of infections. You can have this and you can have that. Hey, I'm a pilot. I got to have good bulbs. I don't want my retina rejecting me. I'll take the risk. So I started the treatment. And I was on it for almost 22 months, getting a shot of this stuff once a month. Well, it just about destroyed my immune system. I started getting colds, had the flu. I hadn't had either in a long time. A scratch on my toe, my big toe, turned into cellulitis with red streaks going all the way up to my knee. That was 500,000 units of penicillin in each of my buttock cheeks and a whole bottle of dicloxacillin to get that under control. And I'm going, well, man, that's not too bad. And then the one that really pissed me off was doctors start looking at my ALT and AST, the liver enzymes, and he goes, oh, you got another enzyme that's high here. He got pancreatitis. I went, no shit. What do we do for that? He says, no alcohol for 6 months. You're shitting me. I can't have my afternoon hot toddy. Nope. No alcohol. No ETOH. Oh, that really tightened my jaws because I like a little rum and coke, before dinner. A little glass of wine with dinner. Nope. Can't have that. That pissed me off. So then I had a little white spot on my forehead and it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And I went, come on in. They shaved it, did the biopsy. Skin cancer. I've had 7 more of them since because it destroyed my immune system and skin cancer just said, oh, no immune system to keep me in check anymore. I'm going to jump right in there and do it. And the last one was kind of the earth shaker, the skin cancer. That could happen to anybody. But the last one was really neat. Woke up one morning and the headache was ear to ear. I was still having cluster headaches at the time. And of course, the neurologist and the guys running this study are trading notes back and forth. Says, what do we do with him? We got to give him all this other stuff for his headaches. Is that going to bother the treatment protocol? No, it's okay. Headache, ear to ear, front to back, and I mean bad. So I called up my doctor, the guy who's the head shed for the protocol. He's the primary guy. And he said, get in here. And he took one look at me and he says, down to radiology. So I did an MRI. And I'm walking, it's probably a quarter of a mile from radiology back up to the National Eye Clinic, down this real long subterranean corridor. And I'm about halfway there, and I see off in the distance 4 people in white lab coats pushing a gurney, and they're running to the high port, and they're heading in my direction. So I just put my back to the wall. I'll get out of their way and let them pass. You know, it's like you see an ambulance coming up behind you, and get out of the way. They stop in front of me, gang tackled me, threw me back on the gurney. Says, what's it? We're going back down. We're going to do an LP under fluoroscopy. I know what that is. You're going to stick a needle in my spine and watch it on X-ray while you're doing it. Yep. Got in there, and he swabbed down my back and put betadine all over it and gave me a couple of shots of Novocaine to kill the pain. I felt him push and push. The needle went in. Juice squirted all over my back. I said, God, don't waste it. He said, I think I got enough of it. And immediately the pain went away. As soon as the juice, interthecal juice, the spinal fluid, shot out of my spinal cord, the pain was gone. Yeah, I mean, it just turned off the pain like that. Man, I like that. So I got up. I felt like a new man. Started walking back up to the eye clinic. And I got up there and they said, you're not going anywhere. We're putting you up in the ward. I said, well, what is it now? Eosinophilic meningitis. Of course, on the way down, they said, your meninges are inflamed. I said, meninges inflamed? It's meningitis. So I kind of knew what they were after, but I didn't know exactly what it was. Well, eosinophil is a type of white blood cell, and it's normally associated with jungle diseases. So he said, well, when's the last time you were in the jungle? It's been a long time. This is 2002, 1984. Oh, all right. That could be it. That wasn't it. It was the monoclonal antibody that had destroyed my immune system. So I got a bad taste in my mouth for the mAbs. They didn't do me any good. They almost destroyed my immune system. It's taken 10 years of vitamin D3 to get back to the point where I have not had a cold or the flu or the coronavirus infection since I started vitamin D3 10 years or 12 years ago.
So, I mean, you know, the risks are, is there any point asking you to talk to the risk? But it doesn't sound like there is one. I know we covered a couple of conditions like hyperparathyroidism, kidney disease, liver disease, and now,
there are a couple of diseases that people can have that would preclude them starting out with large doses of vitamin D3, but none of them that would preclude them from being treated for the condition, hyperparathyroidism. We have 4 little parathyroid glands. They sit on the back of the thyroid. They're about the size of a grain of rice. And one of the 4 can get involved with what's called an adenoma, a malignant tumor. And when that happens, it just starts squirting out large, copious amounts parathyroid hormone, and that tells the kidneys to turn that 25-OH into 125-OH, which we want to happen in the cellular level, but it's happening in the bloodstream, and it's pulling too much calcium out of the gut and the bones. And so we're going hypercalcemic. We're out of our normal range. So that's something you don't want to have. Well, probably 3 or 4 out of 1,000 had that condition anyway before they even started vitamin D3.
Can it just be one of them, one of the parathyroid glands that are involved in a malignancy?
That's all it takes.
And so in terms of the surgical intervention, is it just the one that is removed?
They go in and they're really getting good at it now. They take the little tube, they go in there and they grab it and pull it out.
And so that leaves someone with 3.
You don't want to get rid of all of them because they're essential. People who've had their thyroid removed have all kinds of problems because now they have to go on a basic thyroxine, T1, T2, T3, all kinds of treatment to make up for the loss of those particular hormones. Hormone therapy for the rest of their life.
Yeah.
So you want to leave the good guys there.
And so in terms of, I mean, there's additional benefits in trying vitamin D first before trying these monoclonals or choosing vitamin D over a monoclonal. More benefit than just stopping the cluster headache in terms of supporting a strong and healthy immune system. Have I kind of?
Well, that's the big one. That's it. You just hit the nail on the head. The
Mm,
real benefit is, of course, we all want to stop the pain. And if by all means, if taking a mAb, an anti-CGRP mAb stops the pain, fine, don't argue with it. If it's not broken, don't fix it. You're lucky. But at some point in time, it's probably going to stop working, or you probably won't be able to afford it. And when that happens, vitamin D3.
Because throughout this talk, we've discussed that both of these things are working on CGRP, does that stand to reason then if someone is watching this, has been taking Emgality or one of the monoclonals with some level of success for their cluster headache or migraine, that would maybe also suggest that they would respond well to vitamin D as well?
Yes. And in most cases, during a study for the monoclonal antibodies, the anti-CGRP mAbs, they'll say, we don't want you taking antibiotics. We don't want you taking anything else, because we want to try and measure the actual effectiveness of this monoclonal antibody. So they don't want you to take anything else. Once you're done with that, man, that's like, which religion is going to get me into heaven? I'll stop by any church. I could be a Lutheran, a Catholic, whatever. I go to all of them. So it doesn't really matter. You want to take whatever helps and whatever you can afford, and then you look for the bang for the buck. What's going to do the most good for the least amount of money? And you can't beat vitamin D3 for that.
Yeah, right. And so here's the thing, right? Here's the challenge that people are going to face. Cost benefits, not one of them. We know ordering supplements of vitamin D off a site like Amazon or iHerbs, really pennies per day when stacked up against the costs we've talked about with these new monoclonal.
$4,000 to $5,000 a month.
Yeah.
Buys a lot of vitamin D3, like a lifetime's worth.
Yes, it'd be a well stocked pantry indeed. But get this. I mean, the other aspect is going to see your doctor about migraine or cluster headache. Your doctor is
obviously
more likely going to be recommending to one of these medications before suggesting that you give vitamin D.
Of course.
Go and so naturally, folks are going to question vitamin D and place more trust in what their doctor is saying. What would you say to someone that's kind of going, "Oh, I hear what you're saying, guys, but my family doctor."
Well, I think one of the silver linings to the black cloud that's been the COVID-19 pandemic is big government, big pharma did not have the right answer. A lot of people died that should not have died because, first of all, no early treatment. Wait till your lips turn blue, and then you go to the hospital, and then they put you on a life support system, and they blew up the alveoli in your lungs and killed you. Too much pressure. When if they started treating you early on, you'd have had a much better chance. And what we've learned since then is, man, vitamin D3, I mean, if you haven't had any vitamin D3 and you think you're coming down with it, 600,000 IU for an adult. That's nothing. Million would be better. Million IU.
Mm-hmm.
100,000 IU a day for 6 days or 10 days, and then drop back to 50,000 IU a week. And your risk profile all of a sudden goes whoop. And the benefit profile goes up. Now,
so I mean,
getting back to the monoclonals, I mean, I say the same thing to the people who like magic mushrooms. And they go, well, they always work for me, but now they're not. And I said, well, the problem is you're probably not being able to handle the allergic reaction. And if you had vitamin D3, that's an anti-inflammatory. And then you go after the histamine with an antihistamine, or the full Monty as I call it, and continue taking the magic mushrooms, the two have a synergistic effect. They work well together. I have no doubts whatsoever that somebody on Aimovig could start taking vitamin D3 and all of a sudden find, hey, it's working better now. We already know people who've been getting the mRNA vaccination who are also taking vitamin D3 had no problems at all. Or if they did, they were very minor in comparison to the people who had low vitamin D3, got the shot, and either died or guaranteed that they're going to get the infection. I haven't had it that I know of. My guess is I was infected with the alpha variant a long time ago. My immune system, T cells came in like T-Rex, ate the crap out of them. I'll make you some antibodies and you won't have to worry about it anymore. And oh, by the way, there wasn't any symptoms. It was asymptomatic. So the infection was over and done with. I probably don't even have the antibodies anymore because the body says you're not using them, I'll get rid of them. But I do have the B cells and the smart T cells.
Yeah. So how soon can the body fire up and start producing antibodies in response to coming across, and the spike protein again, for example? Is it kind of an immediate response?
Yes, it's within hours for sure, maybe even down as low as minutes from the time of inoculation with the antigen.
But because I mean, I know it can take from hours to days in order.
How long did it take your skin to go red after the shot?
I didn't.
Sorry, I haven't had it, so I don't know. But
sorry, Mum and Dad.
I've talked to people who says it was a matter of minutes, and all of a sudden arms start puffing up. That's an allergic reaction.
You know, Pete, I will address this for any of my listeners that are watching this show thinking, oh, he didn't get vaccinated. Oh, that's challenging. You know, I feel like I did everything right. Pete, I reached out to our Ministry of Health here with a number of questions that I was personally interested in having the answer for, to be able to, have informed consent before I was prepared to take the vaccine. And it took four and a half months for my concerns to my questions to be answered. And in that time, the thing pretty much came and went. And so by the end of it, I ended up getting a response from their science team to explain the optimization of the codons and the use of methyl pseudouridine, which wasn't satisfactory for me anyway. It's kind of the same argument as saying, well, why would I want to put an antibody that's been derived from a murine or mouse rodent cell line in my body, and this body that God.
This is God's house. This is God's house. You want to pollute God's house?
I think that's where you and I have very similar beasts, Pete. I very much believe that. I haven't been to church in a while, but I certainly have that view that, this day and age where we start cracking open the book of life and start manipulating that code. It's not ours to manipulate. And I've got really strong feelings about that.
Yep.
Strong feelings indeed. So there are 11 or so reasons a doctor might be reluctant to suggest vitamin D. I'm going to put them up on screen now for the folks at home. You can have a look over them. Number one myth: excess vitamin D will turn the human body into marble. Now, I just want you to talk to this. I think that the other ones will make sense to people and they can kind of read into them. But that point there is something that was the first question I gave a talk to a group of Toastmasters yesterday about my journey with vitamin D and cluster headache. And the very first question was, hold on a second, if you take vitamin D, won't you calcify your arteries and your soft tissue? Can you just tease that out and answer that question?
The answer categorically is no, and I am living proof of it. I have taken enough vitamin D3. I went on the same loading cycle that I suggest for everybody else. I try everything myself first, if I ever wrote it down. 600,000 IU vitamin D3, and I did it in 6 days, 100,000 IU a day. And I've done it several times since then. I was up to taking about 80,000 IU a day, which, if you're familiar with the Coimbra protocol, is where you start, which is 1,000 IU per kilogram of body weight. Sleek me at 80 kilograms. I'm a little below that now, thank God. Anyway, I was at Jack, my serum 25OH up to 270 nanograms per milliliter, 675 nanomoles per liter. My calcium stayed within its normal reference range. My PTH dropped down near the bottom where it was supposed to go. When you depress PTH, that's a good indication you're getting a big bang for the buck out of the vitamin D3. As long as you keep the calcium somewhere within its normal reference range.
Yeah.
It's never been out of it. It never been out of it. My primary care physician thought he was going to have a heart attack the first time. He had his knickers in a wad. He was having fibrillation. He said, "Oh, you've got 120 nanograms per milliliter." And I said, "Yeah, what's my calcium?" He goes, "Well, it's normal." Well, so there's no hypercalcemia, right? No hypercalcemia. There's no vitamin D3 intoxication or vitamin D3 toxicity, then, is there? And he says, "Well, no." And he says, "And your phosphorus is okay too. But oh, by the way, the rest of your labs are all in the green. So it must not be anything harmful about taking that much vitamin D3. I was taking 10,000 IU at the time. So you will not. It's been people who go on the Coimbra protocol take an extra precaution. They lay away from high calcium foods, no dairy products. Then they drink, 2.5 liters of water a day, help flush excess calcium out of your system.
There is
very simple to do.
Fantastic presentation by the doctor himself.
Oh yeah.
Explain the protocol. I'll link for people. Go and check it out and learn more about what that guy's up to. In support of your regimen, Pete, which is certainly not taking kind of that 80,000 international units per day as a maintenance dose, more rounded to keep your level as floating around that 80 to 100 nanogram per milliliter mark. To conclude today's session, just talk to us. There's a current study being done in America looking at using the same amount of vitamin D as prescribed in your regimen. Can you tell the folks about that?
The study is being conducted through the University of Texas, Houston, and the doctor who's doing it has been a frequent guest at the Cluster Buster conferences. I gave a presentation on my protocol in 2019. He was in the audience, and when my presentation was over, they were having a roundtable with 5 neurologists up on the stage in the dais. He had to be the first guy to stand up, and he looked out in the audience and says, "Okay, how many of you guys are following Batch's regimen?" I turned around and looked. There were a good 50 hands went up. And he says, "Okay, how many of them found it didn't work?" I looked around, only about 5 hands went up. He looked at me and mouthed the words, "We got to talk."
Wow.
So I went over and got him started. And I worked with him for almost a year on his protocol. It's slimmed down. It's only 10,000 IU a day. And I said, we got to get as many of the cofactors in there as possible. So we'll take the mature multi, because it's got almost everything you need. So that's it, 2 of those. Everything else is a placebo. And they're getting it for a long enough period of time at a 10,000 IU a dose. So the exposure period is significant. And my guess is, instead of 82%, like we're seeing with the full Monty and everything else we're doing, he's probably going to see about a 70% amongst all cluster headache sufferers are going to have a favorable response. And I think we've already found a couple of people who've been on the study.
Exactly.
Who said, yeah, it worked.
Being a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, the person...
they don't know yet, but the guess is they probably got the good stuff.
She didn't know, but she certainly knew, if you know what I mean. The cluster stopped.
Oh, yeah.
The cluster
Well,
stopped.
there's a very interesting thing about cluster headaches and the placebo effect. The placebo effect is extremely low, and it's only best determined amongst chronic sufferers, because you never know for the episodic types whether, oh, I got a great response out of it, or it was the end of cycle. But the chronic guys and gals, that's the acid test. If it stops it for them for longer than a couple of weeks, which is the window they give you for that particular diagnosis, actually it's up to almost a month now. You can have a month off and still be considered chronic, as long as the other 11 months are daily. So, yeah, it's working.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be 1 or 2 years before we see the results from that.
At least probably another 3 years.
The one of the participants was pretty sure that she was in the intervention group because she saw just such a dramatic improvement in her condition. The study finished and she went out and is now taking vitamin D. Surprise, surprise.
Surprise, yeah.
I mean, it's great. It's so good to hear. It's so great.
I asked Mark, I said, what do you do for the people who've completed the study? I said, obviously you want to maintain, mum, you don't want them talking too much, but what do you tell them they ought to do? And what do you follow up with? Said, at least 10,000 IU a day. I would suggest, that's what you ought to tell them. And if they haven't responded, then, there's some other things that they can do too. Have them try Benadryl, see if that helps. And if it does, then we can talk about the full Monty. But he didn't want to get into that. He's pretty tight-lipped and close hold over it, because he's trying to keep the bad guys from pointing fingers and saying that they doctored the study. He doesn't want that to happen. But the interesting thing from my study is most people respond in a week to 10 days. Now, when we first started this, there was no loading dose for the first 14 months of this online study. So these people were just taking 10,000 IU a day, and boom, in the first week to 10 days, we're seeing 75 to 80% of the favorable responses occurring that fast. Well, there's no way in hell they could have built their 25-OH up to 80 nanograms per milliliter in that short amount of time.
Yeah.
But what was happening was the naked vitamin D3 molecule was getting out of their gut into the bloodstream and going straight into the swash and getting in there into the neurons and the glia in a high enough concentration to start that genetic expression and downregulate the peptides. This is one of those, oh, by the way, how did we get in this condition in the first place? And there's a term for it, but basically it's the same thing, that you're failing to meet your metabolic and nutritional needs with the right food. And that happens sometime between Mr. Sperm meeting Miss Egg and you popping out of the other end during the gestation period, and you were not getting enough vitamin D3, so you developed the propensity to have a cluster headache. That's the Batcheller theory of it. And there's a term for it, but it's fundamentally you were vitamin D3 deficient in your earliest formative stage. And that's what resulted in the tendency for you to have a cluster headache.
That'll be, I mean, that's interesting. And it's, it goes to the point of my next podcast on with Roger Price, who is an upper airway genius, knows everything about breathing, and talks again about breathing habits being formed in that very early period, having significant physiological outcomes later on in life. So I certainly see what you're saying. I just wonder how many other bits and how that psychology piece possibly fits into. It's
not just cluster headache. They're finding obesity, diabetes. There's all kinds of things that are happening. It's the term we're looking for there was called genetotropic, which means it's a disorder that's happened because you failed to meet the metabolic and nutritional needs that are called for genetically in your genome. They're saying you got to have this and you need this. This is part of your human genome, and you're not meeting those requirements, so you're paying the price for it now.
Very good, Pete. Let's wrap this up and conclude, because
Okay.
we're now just having a conversation amongst friends. It seems I'm sure people will enjoy the subject matter. For folks wanting to learn more about your regimen, as always, let us know where we can find it, and what folks can do moving forward if they want to explore the regimen.
I keep the current published version up on Vitamin D Wiki. It's been there since January 2017. Over 85,000 copies downloaded. So the word's getting out about it. It's also up on a couple of medical study sites where I'm also a member. It doesn't get downloaded quite as frequency from there, but it's available. And I'm still working on what I call a working draft update, and I hope to have that done sometime fairly soon here, because it's changed, but it hasn't. For example, I was going to start pushing for a larger loading dose. Not necessary. 600,000 is perfectly fine. Somewhere between 80 and 100 nanograms per milliliter, or up to 250 nanomoles per liter. That's more than sufficient if you can get rid of the reaction to histamine. Once you get rid of the reaction to histamine, boom, vitamin D requirement drops, makes it real easy.
Mm-hmm.
But if you still got a lot of histamine, then you have to do what I tried to do, which was to overpower with more and more and more vitamin D3. That's why I took mine up to as much as 80,000 IU a day. Don't need that much. Matter of fact, as it stands right now, I haven't taken any vitamin D3 since the first week in March. But I'm taking the full Monty, at least 2 grams a day of the first 4 supplements. And I just went through one of the heaviest pollen seasons we've had here. I mean, my truck looked like it'd been hit with a bag of Portland cement from the alder pollen, and the big leaf maple tree pollen turned everything yellow, like somebody jumped a big bottle of flour sulfur all over everything. I mean, bright yellow, no problems. And I wasn't taking any vitamin D3. But my burn rate, and I've tested this before in the past, is about 15 nanograms per milliliter per month. So starting out at 270, which is up where I was, I haven't burned through a lot of it yet. But that's very interesting. How fast do we burn vitamin D3? And for me, 77-year-old retired fighter pilot, I'm burning it at the rate of about 15 nanograms per milliliter per month. So there's a little benchmark.
That'll change as well as you go into summertime over there in Washington State, I'm sure.
I keep a hat on all the time. I've already lost 4 square inches of hide off the top of my head to the skin quacks. And I mean, if they put any more stitches in, yours will be up on top of my head.
What were they melanomas, Pete?
One of them was a melanoma. The rest of them were garden variety, what they call it. Well, one of them was inconclusive, and 2 of them were squamous cell
Okay.
carcinoma. Okay. One was melanoma.
What do you reckon about vitamin D and melanoma?
Well, I started having these 3 years before I started vitamin D3. And I started having them as a result of taking a monoclonal antibody. So I'll make the association because it was in the paper for all those things that could possibly happen, informed consent paper that I signed. They said these could happen, and they all happened. So skin cancer was one of them. Yeah. I've also lost a kidney, and my urologist and I are fully confirmed that was probably the likelihood of a fallout of the tocilizumab, because there have been other cases of kidney cancer with people who took tocilizumab.
Well,
Nobody in my background, nobody either side of the family ever had kidney problems, other than too much alcohol. And that was a liver problem.
Pete, thanks for this. Always good to catch up with you. Who knows what we'll be talking about next time? Such an interesting man. Take care, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All the best, Craig, and keep it up. You've got a lot of popularity going for your videos now.